forest breathed like a living thing, each gust of wind stirring the gnarled branches into a whispering, accusing symphony. As I stepped out of the truck, the air hit me, thick, damp, and reeking of something sweet and metallic. Blood, fresh enough that it clung to the back of my throat. The construction site was a mess. Heavy machinery sat abandoned, their steel frames scratched and gouged. Piles of wood and tools lay scattered, splattered with what I could only hope was rust. Deep gouges marked the ground, as if some massive predator had dragged its claws through the soil. I tightened my grip on the machete at my side. My other hand brushed the shotgun slung over my shoulder, the familiar weight steadying me. There wasn't going to be a warm welcome. I'd been on jobs like this before, isolated areas, too many whispers of strange sightings. But this felt different. This felt wrong. "Hello," I called out, knowing damn well no one would answer. Still, my voice broke the silence, and for a moment, I thought maybe the forest would respond with something normal. A bird, a rustling squirrel, anything, but nothing came. I moved deeper into the site, boots crunching over shards of glass and something wet I didn't dare look at. My eyes scanned every shadow, every corner of the site. It was too quiet, too still. My stomach twisted when I found the first sign of life, or what was left of it. The body was sprawled against a half-built cabin, its head turned at an impossible angle. Limbs bent backward, bones jutting from torn flesh. The chest cavity was hollowed out, and something had gnawed on the ribs. A crow sat nearby, pecking at the remains, its black feathers glistening with gore. I crouched beside it, examining the ground. The blood trail didn't make sense, splatters leading away from the body, like it had been dragged after. Whatever happened. My fingers brushed something small and metallic. A badge, Daniel's foreman. A moan carried through the trees, low, guttural, and wet, like someone choking on their own spit. I stood, heart pounding, and unsheathed the machete. The sound came again, closer this time, and my hand tightened around the hilt. Then I saw it. It stepped into the clearing on all fours, its limbs too long and its frame too thin to be anything natural. Pale, almost translucent skin stretched taut over its bones, veins pulsing with a sickly green glow. Its head cocked to the side, mouth stretching open to reveal jagged, needle-like teeth. Its black, bottomless eyes locked onto me. The wretch. The creature moved fast, faster than anything that size had a right to. It lunged, claws scraping the air where my head had been a second earlier. I rolled, bringing the machete up in a desperate arc. The blade met resistance, cutting deep into its forearm. Black ichor sprayed, sizzling as it hit the ground. The thing screamed, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring. It jerked back, dragging the machete from my grip. I reached for the shotgun, but it was on me again, claws raking across my chest. Pain exploded through my ribs, and I stumbled, firing blindly. The buckshot caught it in the side, blowing a chunk of flesh away. It staggered, but instead of retreating, it grinned, black blood dripping from its mouth. "Oh, you like that?" I snarled, leveling the barrel at its face. It leapt before I could fire, hitting me like a freight train. We tumbled to the ground, and its claws wrapped around my throat. I brought a knee up into its chest, throwing it off just enough to grab the machete still embedded in its arm. With a grunt, I yanked the blade free and drove it into its neck. The wretch convulsed, its black blood splattering my face and arms as it thrashed. Its body began to melt, flesh sliding off bone in a steaming heap of gore. The stench was unbearable, and I gagged, shoving myself to my feet as its remains hissed and bubbled into the dirt. I didn't have time to catch my breath. The moan came again, louder this time, and then another and another. I turned toward the tree line, heart sinking. Shadows shifted between the trunks, pale and misshapen. Too many. Dozens of them, their black eyes gleaming as they emerged from the darkness, their bodies twitching and crawling in ways no living thing should. A pack. Of course, I muttered, gripping the machete with one hand and reloading the shotgun with the other. The first one lunged, and I met it midair with the machete, splitting its face down the middle. Black ichor splattered my boots as it dropped, but two more replaced it, their claws swiping at my legs. I fired point blank, the blast tearing one in half, but the other tackled me, its teeth snapping inches from my throat. I shoved the barrel of the shotgun under its jaw and pulled the trigger. Its head exploded in a spray of black mist, but the recoil sent me sprawling. My back hit the ground hard, and before I could get up, another wretch was on me, its acidic saliva dripping onto my face. I screamed as the burn seared my skin. Desperate, I grabbed a nearby rock and smashed it into the creature's head. Once, twice. The bone cracked, and it slumped over, twitching. I staggered to my feet, the edges of my vision swimming. The pack circled me now, their moans harmonizing into a horrifying, guttural symphony. "This is gonna suck," I muttered, gripping the machete tighter as they closed in. And then they charged. The air was alive with the sound of their moans, a symphony of agony that reverberated through the construction site. My chest burned from the claw marks, and my legs screamed in protest as I ran, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel them behind me, skittering, clawing, tearing. I burst into the foreman's office and slammed the door shut, shoving a desk in front of it. The flimsy lock wouldn't hold them back for long. I stumbled to the corner of the room, breathing hard, blood dripping from the fresh burns on my face. I gritted my teeth and reached for the first aid kit hanging on the wall, ripping it open and slapping gauze over the worst of the wounds. The antiseptic stung like hell, but pain meant I was still alive. A sharp crash from outside made me freeze. The creatures were getting bolder, their voices rising into guttural whispers, mimicking my own voice. "Help me! It hurts. Run." I clenched my jaw. They were playing with me, trying to drive me out into the open. I wasn't falling for it. Not yet. The silence didn't last. A deafening bang shook the office as something heavy hit the door, cracking the flimsy wood. I grabbed the shotgun, my hands trembling but steady enough to reload. I'd already burned through too much ammo, and I didn't have enough silver-coated rounds to take out the whole pack. "Think, Lucas," I muttered. The desk splintered as claws punched through, pale fingers groping for me. I aimed at the opening and fired. The blast ripped through the door, sending one of the wretches flying back. The others howled, their moans now furious and shrill. The door caved in. They poured in like water through a broken dam, pale and writhing, their black eyes locked on me. I grabbed the nearest thing, a flare gun, and fired. The red light burst in the center of the pack, setting one of them ablaze. Its body writhed, the flames eating away its skin as it shrieked. The others recoiled from the light, their claws shielding their faces. I didn't waste the opportunity. I dove through the shattered window, glass tearing at my jacket and skin as I hit the ground hard. My shoulder popped, but I didn't stop moving. The pack regrouped quickly, their moans rising as they chased me through the sight. I zigzagged between machinery, grabbing anything I could use as a weapon. A crowbar, a half-empty can of gasoline. Desperation made me creative. One of them leapt at me from the shadows. I swung the crowbar, catching it across the face. Its skull cracked, but it didn't go down. The creature grabbed my arm, its acidic saliva dripping onto my sleeve, sizzling through the fabric. I roared in pain and shoved it back, lighting the gasoline-soaked rag I'd stuffed into the can. "Catch!" I shouted, throwing the makeshift firebomb. The explosion was deafening. Flames erupted, engulfing 3 of the creatures. Their shrieks pierced the night, and the smell of burning flesh turned my stomach. I coughed, covering my mouth as smoke filled the air. The fire didn't stop them. The remaining wretches crawled through the flames, their glowing veins pulsing brighter as if feeding off the destruction. "Of course you'd like fire," I muttered, backing toward the forest edge. The mimicry began again, their voices cruel and mocking. "You can't save them. Run, Lucas. This is your fault." "Shut up!" I shouted, firing the last shell in my shotgun. The closest wretch exploded into a spray of black ichor, but there were still too many. I ran into the trees, my boots slipping on moss and wet leaves. The forest felt alive, every branch reaching for me, every shadow hiding something worse. I could hear them behind me, relentless, their claws scraping bark as they climbed and leapt from tree to tree. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. Not here, not like this. I stumbled into a clearing, the faint moonlight revealing something strange, a circle of stones covered in carvings. Symbols, the kind you see in books about rituals and sacrifices. I didn't have time to study them. The pack had found me. They surrounded the clearing, moving with a predatory grace. Their moans were softer now, almost like laughter. They knew I had nowhere to go. "All right," I muttered, pulling the machete from its sheath. My free hand reached for the UV flashlight clipped to my belt. "Let's dance." The first one charged, and I sidestepped, swinging the machete in a brutal arc. Its head tumbled to the ground, black ichor spraying from its neck as its body crumpled. The others didn't flinch. 2 came at me together. I blinded one with the UV light, its skin blistering and peeling as it screamed. The other tackled me to the ground, its claws tearing into my back. I jammed the machete into its chest, twisting until its body went limp. Pain blurred the edges of my vision. I couldn't keep this up. I stumbled back toward the stones, the wretches circling closer. The symbols on the stones seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight, almost as if they were alive. An idea hit me, a desperate, insane idea. I dropped the machete and grabbed the largest stone, pulling it free from the ground. The symbols glowed brighter, and the wretches recoiled, hissing. I raised the stone high and slammed it into the ground, shattering it. The light exploded outward, blinding me. The wretches screamed, their bodies convulsing as the light burned them. One by one they collapsed, their flesh melting into black pools. Silence fell. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air. My body was broken, blood soaking my clothes, but I was alive. The light from the broken stone faded, leaving the clearing in darkness once more. But as I listened to the silence, I realized it wasn't over. Far in the distance, deeper in the forest, came a low, guttural moan. The pack wasn't done with me yet. The forest felt alive now, breathing and shifting with every step I took. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like something watching me, waiting for me to fail. My legs wobbled beneath me, my chest burned, and the blood-soaked gauze on my ribs did nothing to dull the pain. But there was no stopping. Not now. The light from the shattered stone had given me a reprieve, but it wasn't permanent. Far off, I could still hear their moans, faint but persistent, like a tide creeping closer. My machete was slick with ichor. My UV flashlight barely had a charge left, and my shotgun was a glorified club now. I was running out of options, but I wasn't done. The forest opened up into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, gnarled tree. Its roots twisted like skeletal fingers into the earth, and its bark was carved with the same symbols I'd seen on the stones. But this wasn't just a tree. It was a doorway. Beneath it, a jagged fissure led into the ground, black and gaping like a wound in the world. Of course, I muttered. The fucking pit of despair. The faint moans grew louder. They were close. Too close. I didn't have a choice. Gripping the machete tighter, I descended into the darkness. The air inside the cavern was thick and wet, like breathing through a soaked rag. The walls pulsed faintly, veins of green light coursing through the rock, like the forest itself was alive. The smell was overwhelming. Decay, acid, and something sharp and chemical that made my eyes water. The tunnel sloped downward, narrowing as I went. My boots squelched through something sticky, and when I shined the light down, I wished I hadn't. The floor was covered in viscous black sludge, chunks of bone and flesh embedded within. I swallowed hard and pressed on. The tunnel opened into a massive chamber, and my stomach lurched. The nest, it was a pit, a writhing, stinking mass of flesh and bodies. Dozens of them, all in various states of decay, fused together like something out of a nightmare. Some were barely human anymore, their features twisted and distorted, their mouths moving soundlessly as if begging for release. The walls were lined with strange sacs, pulsating like hearts, each one holding the pale outline of something inside. And then I saw it, the Alpha. It sat perched on a mound of bones, its grotesque body larger than any of the others. Its limbs were longer, its frame bulkier, and its glowing veins pulsed brighter with each breath it took. Its face was a nightmare. A jagged, lipless grin stretched across its skeletal jaw, and its black eyes gleamed with a malevolent intelligence. "Fuck," I whispered. The Alpha's head tilted, and it let out a low growl that echoed through the chamber. As if on cue, the sacks on the walls began to split open, and pale, twitching shapes tumbled out. Fresh wretches. I didn't wait for them to get their bearings. I grabbed the flare gun from my belt and fired, the red light streaking through the cavern and igniting one of the sacks. The flames spread fast, climbing up the walls and consuming the writhing shapes within. The Alpha roared, its voice shaking the ground beneath my feet. It leapt from its perch, moving with horrifying speed, and I barely rolled out of the way in time. Its claws slammed into the ground where I'd been standing, sending shards of rock flying. I swung the machete, the blade catching its arm, but it didn't slow. The thing backhanded me, sending me sprawling into the pit. My back hit something soft, too soft, and I realized with a sickening lurch that I was lying on a pile of corpses. The Alpha descended, its massive frame blotting out the green glow of the walls. I scrambled to my feet, slipping in the gore, and raised the machete just as it lunged. The blade sliced across its chest, but it was like cutting stone. The thing roared and swiped at me, its claws catching my arm. Pain exploded, and I nearly dropped the machete. "Come on, you bastard!" I hissed through gritted teeth, swinging again. This time, The blade caught its neck, and the Alpha staggered, but it didn't fall. Its black eyes locked on mine, and I felt something cold slither into my mind. "You can't stop this," the voice whispered, though its mouth never moved. "You're just meat." "Maybe," I snarled, "but I'm meat with a lighter." I yanked the gasoline canister from my bag, slamming it into the creature's chest. It staggered back, confused, as I pulled a flare from my belt and lit it. The cavern erupted in flames. The Alpha shrieked, its massive form writhing as the fire consumed it. The other wretches screeched in unison, their bodies blistering and melting as the flames spread. The walls pulsed violently, green veins bursting and spewing ichor as the nest collapsed around me. I didn't wait to see the end. I ran, every muscle screaming in protest as the fire roared behind me. The tunnel shook, chunks of rock falling as I stumbled out into the forest. The ground trembled, and a deafening roar split the air as the cavern collapsed, swallowing the nest and everything inside it into the earth. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air as the forest fell silent. No moans, no whispers, just the crackle of distant flames. But as I looked back at the smoldering ruins, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The Alpha's voice echoed in my mind, cold and taunting. "You're just meat." The forest was burning. Orange and red flickered through the trees, illuminating the devastation I'd left behind. Smoke rose in dark plumes, choking the air and stinging my eyes. Every muscle in my body screamed, my wounds burned like hellfire, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop, because they weren't done. The moans began again, distant at first, but growing louder with each step. The fire hadn't killed them all. It had only pissed them off. The first wretch burst through the trees, its pale, emaciated form illuminated by the flames. Its glowing veins pulsed like a heartbeat as it lunged, claws outstretched. I swung the machete, the blade connecting with its neck. The head went flying, but the momentum threw me off balance. I staggered and fell, landing hard on my already bruised shoulder. Before I could get up, two more wretches emerged from the smoke, their guttural growls harmonizing into something primal and cruel. "Fuck this," I spat, yanking the flare gun from my belt. I fired, the flare striking one of them square in the chest. It screeched as flames erupted, but the second wretch was already on me. Its claws raked across my legs, slicing through flesh and muscle. I screamed, swinging the machete wildly. The blade caught it in the side, and I drove it deeper until the creature fell back, writhing in a pool of its own ichor. I forced myself to my feet, using the machete as a crutch. Blood poured from the gash in my leg, soaking my jeans and dripping onto the forest floor. I couldn't take much more of this, but then I heard it, the moan that made the others sound like whispers, deep, resonant, and vibrating through my bones. The Alpha was still alive. "Of course it is," I muttered, limping toward the edge of the forest. The trees gave way to a narrow ravine, its rocky edges shrouded in mist. A half-finished bridge stretched across it, wooden planks barely clinging to rusted steel supports. The construction crew must have abandoned it weeks ago. Below, the ravine dropped into darkness, the faint sound of rushing water echoing from the depths. The Alpha emerged from the smoke, its massive frame silhouetted against the inferno behind it. Its body was scorched and blistered, chunks of flesh hanging from its bones, but it was still standing, still grinning. Behind it, more wretches crawled out of the forest, their glowing eyes fixed on me. "All right, you ugly bastard," I said, gripping the machete tighter. "Let's finish this." The alpha charged, and I barely had time to dive out of the way. Its claws scraped against the ground, sending sparks flying as it spun, faster than anything that big had a right to be. I swung the machete, but it caught the blade with one massive claw and yanked it from my grip, tossing it aside like a toy. "Shit!" I stumbled back, fumbling for the last weapon in my arsenal, a small homemade explosive I'd scavenged from the construction site. The alpha lunged and I ducked, slamming the explosive into its chest. It howled, swiping at me and knocking me to the ground, but I managed to roll out of reach. "Hey, asshole!" I yelled, holding up the detonator. "Smile for the camera." I pressed the button. The explosion ripped through the night, throwing me backward as the alpha's body disintegrated into a spray of black ichor and molten flesh. The force of the blast was enough to shake the ground, sending chunks of rock tumbling into the ravine. But the wretches didn't stop. The remaining creatures charged, their moans blending into a deafening roar. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the machete from where it had landed. My body screamed in protest, but I raised the blade, ready to go down swinging, and then the bridge collapsed. The explosion must have weakened the supports, because the entire structure groaned and splintered, taking half the ravine's edge with it. The wretches fell in a chaotic cascade, their pale bodies disappearing into the darkness below. I barely managed to grab onto a jagged rock, the machete slipping from my grasp as the ground crumbled beneath me. For a moment I dangled there, the sound of rushing water echoing from the depths. With a grunt, I pulled myself up, collapsing onto solid ground. My chest heaved, my vision blurred, and every nerve in my body screamed for rest. The moans were gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the blackened forest and the smoldering ruins of the nest. The alpha was dead, the pack was gone, I'd won. But as I dragged myself to my feet and limped back toward the construction site, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. From the shadows, deep in the trees, a pair of glowing black eyes blinked once, then disappeared. Dawn crept in slowly, painting the sky in muted hues of gray and orange. The forest was silent now, the fires reduced to smoldering embers. Smoke hung low in the air, mingling with the coppery stench of blood and ichor. Every step back to the construction site was agony. My leg throbbed with every pulse of my heart. The gashes on my chest ached like they were still being torn open, and the burns on my face felt like they were carved into bone. But I was alive. The site was a graveyard. The heavy machinery, once towering and indestructible, was now twisted scrap metal. Pools of black ichor steamed in the early morning light, and the ground was littered with the shattered remains of tools, tents, and what was left of the crew. No bodies, just pieces. I stumbled toward the foreman's office, the last building still standing, my machete dragged behind me, its edge dull and covered in dried ichor. I didn't need it anymore. Not here. Inside, the air was stale and quiet. The desk I'd shoved in front of the door was splintered, but the rest of the room remained untouched. I slumped into the chair, every part of me screaming in protest, and pulled out my flask. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it wasn't enough to drown the images in my head. The alpha, the nest, the bodies fused together, begging for help. I closed my eyes, but the memories were seared into my mind like a brand. There was no escaping them. Not now, maybe not ever. I must have passed out, because when I opened my eyes, The sun was higher, spilling pale light through the cracked window. My leg was stiff, the blood on my jeans dried and crusted. Every muscle in my body begged me to stay in that chair, to let the forest swallow me up. But I couldn't. There were things to do, and questions to answer. I found a notepad on the foreman's desk, the pages smudged with dirt and grease. Flipping through it, I found scattered notes about the project, complaints from workers about strange sounds at night, claims of tools going missing, only to show up twisted and melted, and one phrase scrawled over and over again in desperate, jagged handwriting: "We woke something." "No shit," I muttered, tossing the notepad aside. I couldn't leave the site without leaving a warning. The company would send more people, more crews, more machines, and the forest wasn't empty. I'd seen those eyes in the shadows, and I wasn't stupid enough to believe the nightmare was over. Grabbing a marker from the desk, I wrote a message on the back of an old work order and pinned it to the door. "Do not return. They are still here." I wasn't sure they'd listen, but that wasn't my problem. Not anymore. The drive out of the forest was quiet. The truck rattled over the uneven dirt road, the tires crunching through ash and debris. Every so often I'd glance at the tree line, half expecting to see a pale figure darting between the trees. But the forest was still, watching. When I finally hit the highway, the tension in my chest loosened a little. The horizon stretched out before me, empty and endless, and for a moment I felt a sliver of peace. Then I noticed it. On the rearview mirror, hanging from the corner, was a small smear of black ichor. My stomach turned as I stared at it, my mind racing. I'd cleaned the truck. I'd checked everything before leaving. It shouldn't be there. I pulled over, my hands trembling as I grabbed a rag and wiped the mirror clean. But as I turned back to the road, my eyes caught something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall and pale, its black eyes locked on me even from hundreds of feet away. As I blinked, it tilted its head, that same jagged grin spreading across its skeletal face. I didn't wait. The truck roared as I slammed on the gas, the forest shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. But that grin stayed in my mind, etched into the darkness behind my eyelids. The wretches were still out there, watching, waiting,